Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, April 2nd, 2009. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. With this week, Australian home brewers Dan Walker and Geoff Hammond join us to explain brew in a bag brewing. Some brewers look on the practice in a skeptical way, but Dan and Geoff are convinced that brew in a bag is a great way to brew all-grain beer. Well, if you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. And you can follow me on Twitter. My username is Basic Brewing, all one word. Also, you can find me on Facebook. My username there is Basic Brewing James. We also have a Basic Brewing Radio and Basic Brewing Video fan page on Facebook. And if you become a fan of the show there, I'll be sending out notices when the shows are posted and such like that. Our 2009 Brewers logbooks are still going out the door. We still got some, so you can check them out at our online store at basicbrewingshop.com and get yours if you don't have yours yet. And thanks again to everybody clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. Whenever you think of Amazon, think of us and click on our associate link first. It won't cost you any extra, and you'll be helping us to bring you the show. We appreciate your support, as usual. I talked to Dan and Geoff for a good bit of time, so I want to make the introduction short this week. Plus, I'm recording this a bit ahead of time for scheduling purposes. But I do have a short update from Mark Emily up in Washington State. And just imagine that the legislation update music is going right about here. Mark says, we have worked through an amendment to Senate Bill 5060 with the Liquor Control Board, which will maintain our main goals of serving homemade beer and wine at private events, such as club meetings, neighbors' dinner, National Homebrewers Conference, exhibitions, and competitions. The amendment to the bill was added last week and was supported by the House Commerce and Labor Committee with a unanimous do pass recommendation. Our next step is through the House Rules Committee and onto the House floor. Mark says, please help by contacting the committee and your representatives now again. And for more details on what you need to do, if you need to do it, that might get more attention. For more details on what you need to do to support this bill if you live in Washington State, go to wahomebrewers.org/legal. That's wahomebrewers.org/legal. And I appreciate Mark's continued efforts to keep us posted on the updates up there, and good luck, continued good luck up there. Also an update on the Basic Brewing Radio Brew Your Own Magazine collaborative experiment that you heard Chris and me talk about last week, Chris Colby and me. I've been tweaking the form that we're going to use to collect your data, so I hope to have that out there by the end of this week. And you'll find that at basicbrewing.com/experiment. That's basicbrewing.com/experiment. Or there's a link on the Basic Brewing Radio page on our site, and I believe that Chris is planning to put a link on BYO too. But there is a page out there now that has some of the details of what we're wanting you to collect to get you started. And that experiment, if you haven't listened to last week's show, is to see what 2 additional weeks on the primary yeast will do to your beer, both from a gravity and taste perspective. Will you start to get off flavors from the yeast after 2 additional weeks? You know, we're basically testing how safe it will be to keep your beer on the primary yeast cake, essentially, for a couple of extra weeks. Our initial proposal for the experiment was to brew a batch of beer, and at the point where you would normally rack or package, go ahead and rack half of that beer out of the primary, then leave the second half for 2 more weeks, then package that half. Now, I've heard from some of you who are saying that you're worried about the effects of oxidation on the half left in the primary. So you're doing things like having 2 primary fermenters going at the same time and leaving one undisturbed for the additional 2 weeks. Now, Chris and I actually thought about that approach at first, but then we thought that adding another primary would add to the number of variables. For instance, is one fermenter in a slightly better place than the second one? Is one cleaner than the other? Is one yeast packet fresher, etc.? So we went with the idea of racking half of that single beer off the single fermenter. If you're worried about oxidation at the point that you rack off, if you keg and you have CO2, what you may want to do is purge what's left in the primary with CO2, since the CO2 will sink and cover the beer there. But here's what I'm going to do. At the point when I would normally rack off the primary, which is usually 2 weeks for me, I'm going to bottle a handful of singles and transfer half of the batch to secondary, and then package both the primary and secondary halves after 2 weeks. So we'll see in the bottle what happens, how the beer is, if I would do it the way I normally do it. Then we'll see how it tastes, say 4 weeks on the primary, and then 2 weeks on the primary, 2 weeks in the secondary. So we'll have like 3 to taste there. And I know that's going to drive some of you crazy, but that's at least my plan right now. So if you decide to vary in your procedures from what we're suggesting for the experiment, just take detailed notes and let us know when you submit your data. And also you can go to basicbrewing.com/experiment to see what kinds of data that we're wanting you to collect. That's out there right now. The form may not be out there. The PDF may not be out there by the time you hear this. But the kinds of information that we're looking for is out there right now. I'm hoping that several of you will take part in the experiment so that we can see a lot of data to digest. And then if everyone has significant off flavors from 2 additional weeks, let's say, then we'll know that something's up. If your beer is tasting like, rubber bands after it's been on the primary yeast for 4 weeks, no matter what you did, then we'll know something's up. So I appreciate everybody's participation and input, and please keep sending me letters on what you think of this thing as we go along. It's all collaborative. That's what it's all about. Well, now let's head down to Australia via Skype. I've been trying to get together with Dan and Geoff for a while, and I'm glad that we finally found time to get together. And by the way, we were joined part of the way through the interview by Colin Forster, who popped into Dan's house for a beer. Good timing there. Colin is also a brew and a bagger. Or would it be brewer in a bag? Or just a brewer who uses... Anyway, brewing in a bag has made quite a stir down there in Australia, and I wanted to find out the details. Well, Dan Walker and Geoff Hammond, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio.
Nice to be here, James.
Thanks, James.
Well, let's start off. I want to find out where you guys are and kind of a background on who you are as brewers. Let's start off with you, Dan. Where are you, and how long have you been brewing? Kind of give us a background on you as a brewer.
No problems. I'm in Melbourne, Australia, which is down the southeast side of the country. I'm a home brewer of about 3 or 4 years vintage, but I probably got into home brewing because I work for a major brewer in Australia. I work for Foster's, and so my interest in beer came to me through work. Been with Foster's for just about 20 years, most of it as a storeman, but for the last couple of years I've actually been working in the brew house. So a little bit of professional brewing, a lot of home brewing, and just a lot of interest in beer.
So I assume you do brew in a bag, but do you brew in other processes as well?
I actually don't mainly brew in a bag. I use brew in a bag as my pilot method of brewing. So if I'm doing experiments or if I'm doing small batches, I'll brew in a bag. But mostly I've got a 3-vessel Herm system. So
you're either really low-tech or you're high-tech?
More or less, yeah. That's it. I like the brew in the bag method so much that I went and learned about it, and I've promoted it and pushed it just because I think it's a really simple and easy technique to get a handle on. And I looked at it and thought, well, if I was starting brewing tomorrow, I'd do it this way. I built a Herms already before Brew in a Bag was invented, and so I wasn't going to give the damn thing up. Too much time, effort, and swearing invested in building it. But if I was starting tomorrow, I'd be brewing in a bag, and I doubt that I'd bother with changing.
What about you, Geoff? What's your background, and where are you?
A confused IT manager that has just, in the last 6 months or so, moved out into the country a couple of hours north of where Dan's living. But prior to that, I gave up my job and decided I needed to take up some sort of a hobby. Drinking beer seemed like a good idea, but I couldn't afford to buy the commercial stuff, and then got into brewing of sorts. So in the last 2-3 years, I've taken up brewing in a bag exclusively, and it's primarily because I really like the process. It's simple. So I approach the whole thing much differently to Dan, in that it's all experience-based rather than too much technology. And that's pretty much it. I've got a dedicated brewery. I've moved from brewing in a single pot with electric elements in a townhouse to brewing in a shed with gas burners and the brew in a bag process exclusively.
Wow. And would you compare and contrast you guys' approaches to brewing?
Well, I'm very much a suck it and see kind of guy. I started going down the path of trying to be as technical as Dan, and then just got bored with it. So I really do tend to play a lot more, whereas I think Dan goes by the numbers more than I do. Would you say that's the case, Dan?
Yeah, I reckon that's about it. I still like recipes. I'm still learning styles. See, I think that's probably a good way to look at how we approach our brewing is that I pretty much want to brew all the styles as a style, and when I can do that and I can make them right, then I'll say that I've learned enough to start experimenting on a terribly regular basis. So I like the process. I like to get things right. I like to know the numbers, the volumes, the temperatures, and I want them to be the same next time. So I write everything down. And I want to know. Whereas Geoff at one point was measuring his water volumes by, well, it's 12 centimetres from the bottom of the pot. That's all I need to know. And
I still do that. It works fabulously.
How many bloody litres is that? Driving me mad.
And that's the thing, it still works wonderfully. I measure 23 centimetres of water into the pot. I know that what comes out of the pot at the end of a 90-minute boil is enough to fill my no-chill cube, which is enough to fill my fermenter, which is enough to fill a corny keg at the end of it, and it works beautifully. I don't need to know how much it is.
Whereas I need to know. Doesn't matter if I need to know. I need to know.
Well, that's so brew in a bag will fit both philosophies of brewing. It seems like. What about the history of brew in a bag? Where did it come from, and how did it evolve?
I think it's a particularly interesting process because I suspect that it might well be one of the only brewing things that has been actually developed on the internet. I think that Brew in a Bag was pretty much a collaborative project by a bunch of people on the Aussie Homebrewer forum on the web. What it started out as was an idea in the head of a couple of the guys on Aussie Homebrewer. They'd looked at some of the European homebrewing equipment. What are they called? Geoff, do you know what that fancy silver one from Germany is called?
It's a fancy silver thing from Germany.
Yeah. The Germans look at our 3-vessel traditional brewing things and they think we're crazy. They can't understand why we do it because they don't brew that way. They have single-vessel recirculating systems and they cost a god-awful fortune. And so I think people were looking at those trying to work out if they could do that on the cheap. And so there was a few experiments done trying to brew beer in single pots to save room and equipment and complexity, and to emulate these European single vessel breweries. And so there was buckets inside buckets with holes in them and little recirculating pumps and a whole bunch of different things. And then one guy in particular, Pat Hollingdale, said, hang on a minute, we could do this with a bag. And he just went ahead and built it, and that was it. More or less, it was done from there on. And his first effort worked so well, and he'd thought through it well enough that from there on in, it was more or less the standard process. Everyone went, hang on a minute, that seems to make sense, let's have a go. And it's just built from there. So it's been tweaked and refined a little, but more or less it was a community effort to get to a point where someone had an epiphany, and this guy Pat Hollingdale, something went off in his brain and he came out with Brew in a Bag.
Why would someone want to go into Brew in a Bag?
Brew in a Bag is a particularly simple and easy technique of grain brewing. I think it's absolutely perfect for a new grain brewer. If you were already a grain brewer, then there's probably not a lot of reason to change to Brew in a Bag, aside from doing it out of interest. But if you're not a grain brewer already, then there's a goodly list of reasons. And this is, some of this is probably arguable, but from my perspective, Brew in a Bag is cheaper and it needs less equipment than any of the other all grain techniques. It's simpler to do than any of the other all grain techniques. It takes less time than any of the other all grain techniques, and it takes less space for your equipment and your brewing than any of the other all grain techniques.
And Geoff, do you agree?
I do, but I suppose from my own point of view, I just like doing it that way. I've watched people brew the other way, and by that I mean with a multi-vessel system, and it just has an appeal to me, which I can't really explain any better than that. I suppose it's like any other thing in that, do you like a Ford or a General Motors vehicle? I happen to like Brew in a Bag better than the traditional homebrew mash setup.
So let's get started with talking about the process. What equipment do you have to have if you're starting? Say if you're an extract brewer and you've never done an all grain batch, what equipment do you have to get into Brew in a Bag all grain brewing?
If you're already brewing extract, then you pretty much need exactly what you've got plus a bag. It's as simple as that. The bag is made of material known as Swiss foil. In Australia, at least, that's going to be problematic for many people in the States, I've seen. But that's a very fine woven mesh material that's often used for curtain shears. A bag that the pot can fit in, and with some way of closing it up at the tops, like a sleeping bag stuff sack, so that you can pull the grain out of the pot. That's all you need over what you've got at the moment.
Now, I read an article in Brew Your Own magazine by John Palmer in the March-April issue talking about Australian brewing techniques, and Dan, you were quoted in there. And I also, so in addition to the bag, I saw a sort of a grill arrangement in the bottom of the brew pot. Is that necessary or is that helpful?
It's probably optional. It depends what sort of heat you're using. If you're using immersion electric elements like Geoff brewed with for a long time, then absolutely not. If you're heating from under the bottom, maybe. If you're using one of the massively powerful burners that might create a hot spot, then it's probably a nice thing to have just to be sure that you're not going to melt the bag. But there's a lot of people don't use them and don't have any issues at all with bag melting. It's just one of those. If you can find a thing you can stick in there, stick it in there. It'll be you'll sort of belts and braces playing it safe.
So this grill thing or this rack thing, this metal rack, is just to keep the bag off the bottom surface of the pot. Yeah,
just so it doesn't get too hot, and it's probably not going to melt, but it's just to make sure that it doesn't.
Now, how big of a pot do you have for, say, a 5-gallon batch?
You're going to need 40 litres, which is 10 gallons.
So you're going to need a bigger pot than perhaps you're used to dealing with if you're just an extract brewer, just for the volume of all the grain and the water in there as well.
Because everything goes in at once, it all has to fit in there. So all the grain, all the water, everything all at once. You could probably get away with certain sorts of beer. So if you had a small grain bill and you're really only trying to brew just enough to fill up a keg, you could try this in a smaller pot. And there's beers you could brew successfully this way. But to give yourself reasonable flexibility and to not be particularly limited in the beers you can make, you want 10 gallons, 40 litres. And to be really unconstrained about it, you want 50 litres.
And I guess that's something that when people are asking me these sorts of questions, I figure that there's always a chance that you're not going to like the grain brewing caper. And so if you can have a shot at the technique with as little extra expense as you can get away with, then that's not a bad thing. So you might end up with all of the equipment you've already got making a batch of beer that's not quite as big as you used to, but at least you've got a feel for what the process is and whether or not you want to continue to go that way or stay with what you're currently doing.
Now, I tried something similar. I don't know if it was exactly the process that you guys go through, but I tried something similar using a bag and using a pot on my stove with a smaller batch. So you don't necessarily have to brew a full-size, quote-unquote, batch of beer. You can do something smaller in the beginning to kind of play with the process, too.
I absolutely agree with that. So many people get fixed on the notion that they have to brew in 5-gallon batches. In Australia, people want to brew 23 litres of beer because that's just the amount of beer that comes out of a Cooper's homebrew kit. And people are just used to brewing that amount of beer. They don't want to make the effort for less beer than that. If you tell them just brew 15 litres of beer instead, that'll work. Oh no, the crap couldn't do that. They'll run around in circles to brew the amount of beer that they normally brew, whereas they could do a lesser amount simply and easily. And I think that's what Geoff's saying. If you're an extract brewer with a smaller than 10-gallon pot, you can still do this. You'll just make less beer. Mm-hmm. And then when you decide you like it, then maybe you decide to invest in a bigger pot.
So take us through a brew day. When you start, you've got your grain. Do you mill the grain in the way that you would normally mill it for a regular all-grain batch, or are there different specifications for that?
As a rule of thumb, I think that any old milling would be just fine. Whatever your homebrew store mills the grain as, that's cool. However, because you are not likely to get what's known as a stuck sparge with brew in a bag, you can mill it really fine. You can mash pretty much with flour to get more extraction out of the grain, and that's fine. But primarily, whatever comes out of the shop is good enough.
So if you're concerned about losing efficiency in doing this method, you can compensate by milling more aggressively.
Yes,
absolutely.
Or you can buy a bit more grain.
I'd just like to say Colin's just arrived and poured us a beer. So if you hear a little bit of noise in the background, that's Colin. He might pipe in. I don't know if Cole particularly wants to be part of the interview, but if we say something that annoys him, I'm sure he'll pipe up.
Okay. Well, hello to Colin anyway. Whether he decides to.
Good day, James.
Good day or good evening here. Let's. So we've got our grain milled, and we are ready to mash in. So what do? Do we put how much water, how much grain do we put into the brew pot?
Your water is exactly the same as the amount of water you would use if you were batch sparging. So it really doesn't differ from any of the other techniques in the total amount of water you use. It's just that you put it in all at once. So if you use the brewing software, if you're familiar with how batch sparging works, work the water out exactly the same. So really it's a matter of how much you boil off, how much is absorbed by the grain, and that's it. It's just boil off and grain. What you finish with after the end of the boil is your batch size, plus your boil off, plus what's absorbed by the grain, and brew in a bag absorbs less to grain than does other techniques. To give you an example, I've tapped a recipe out of Brewing Classic Styles. So it's designed to fill up a 19-litre corny keg. If you just take the Pilsner recipe out of that book, it uses 5.8 kilos of grain for a 1056 beer, and the object of the game is to fill up a corny keg. If I were brewing that beer, I would start with 30 litres of water in the pot. That would put 19 litres into my corny keg. So I would be finishing my boil with 22.7 litres of water, then losing some to thermal shrinkage, losing some to my yeast, and filling up a 19-litre keg. But yeah, I would start 30 litres of water in the pot. So that's the first thing I would do on my brew day, is put 30 litres of water into my pot and start heating it up.
So one thing you don't have to worry about with this is the dead space in your mash tun
Absolutely not.
Under your false bottom or whatever your filtering system that you use. So you start off. I mean, what traditionally we who have mash tuns, we say, look at our liquor to grist ratio, and we say, I want 1.25 quarts per pound or whatever it is, and then we mash in with that, and then we add sparge water later, whether we do batch sparging or fly sparging. You're saying you just take all that water that you would have added later on and add it in at the beginning, so you're going to have a thinner mash than you would traditionally do. Much
thinner, much. Brew in a bag. I can't do pounds per gallon in my head. I'm sorry. In kilos, a standard-ish liquor to grist ratio is somewhere between 2-to-1 and 3-to-1. So 3 litres of water for every kilogram of grain. And in brew in a bag, it's 6, sometimes 7.
Wow.
So it's twice what it is, at least, in a normal brew.
And do you see any repercussions from that?
It's interesting that all of the theory, depending upon which side of the argument you read, will say that the liquor to grist ratio will result in a drier beer or in a thicker beer. In my experience, it's probably a little bit thinner, but prior to this show, Dan and I were talking, and it could be to do with other elements of my process. But it seems that if you are a little bit concerned, or if it turns out that your beers are a little bit dry, then adding a degree or two to your mash temperature seems to iron all that out, and experientially, problem goes away. Dan?
Yeah. I think it probably does make a little bit of a difference, but it's not much of a difference, and it's certainly far less than the effect of changing your mash temperature. So it might make it a little drier, it might make it a little sweeter, but nothing that can't be fixed entirely by tweaking your mash temperature up or down. So you brew your first one, a little bit dry for you, mash warmer next time. Same as any other brewer would do. You might be at a slightly different spot on the scale, but your adjustments are exactly the same.
So this is one instance where maybe practice proves some of the common knowledge, not necessarily wrong, but not as accurate as we thought it was, as far as the liquor to grist ratio affecting the character of the beer.
Well, I've got to bean my bonnet over that a little, because the common knowledge is exactly that. It's common. It doesn't make it right. Liquor to grist ratios perhaps matter if everything else is kept the same. And even then, they're a very minor effect. And really, once you get out of comparing a thick mash, and by thick I mean really thick, to a thin mash, then there's no difference. Comparing a moderately thin mash with a very thin mash, there's virtually no difference. I mean, I've been talking to Kai. You've interviewed Kai a couple of times recently.
Right.
And he's got some really nice stuff to tell you why. If you read his Science of Mashing papers and do a little bit of thinking about it, then it's a minor effect at best. People latch on to this thing they saw written in Fix or Noonan or Palmer, and they extrapolate from it, but it just doesn't count. It doesn't apply to this situation.
Now, how does the thin mash affect your temperature calculations?
It makes them a lot easier because really, you simply heat your strike water to 2 degrees Celsius higher than your mash temperature. If you want to mash at 66 degrees Celsius, you heat that strike water to basically 68 degrees Celsius and throw in your grain, and it's going to even out at 66.
Now,
because there's so much more water.
Is that taking an average weight of grain? Say, for instance, I did a session ale recently that only had 8 pounds of Maris Otter in it, and that was it. Now, if I have another batch of beer where I have, 10 to 12 pounds of, and forgive me for using American measurements, but I am what I am.
Sure.
but say if I have a significant difference in the weight of the grain, is that going to make a significant difference in that temperature?
Yeah, it is. I don't use the 2 degrees rule myself. I plug the figures into ProMash. And ProMash gets me to hit my temperature every single time. So you tell ProMash or Beersmith or whatever it is how much water you've got, how much grain you've got, what temperatures you want, and it tells you how hot to heat the water up. The 2 degrees is it's 2 degrees Celsius, and it's an average. If you're making a normal sort of beer, so say a 1.045, 1.050 sort of beer, that sort of grain, Bill, 2 degrees will get you pretty damn close.
A point I'd like to make here is that on all of the subjects that we've canvassed today to follow a common thread, and that is about knowing your system, regardless of what it is, and how that relates to other brewers' systems. So James might have a 3-vessel system, and he knows that in order to achieve this mash temperature, he must do the following things. I know the same thing about my system, and so when James says, this is what I do to make this beer, I apply a translation from his system to my system, and I end up with a beer which is hopefully the same. And that applies, I suppose, even between James's 3-vessel system and Dan's 3-vessel system.
And the good thing about brewing a bag is that if you miss your temperature low, you can turn the heat on.
Yes. That's why I like the flexibility of the bag, is that it's a bit harder if you miss hot, which is why I'd usually advise someone who's not done it before to aim a little low, because you've got 40 litres nearly of stuff in this pot now. It doesn't lose temperature really fast, and you've already got all your water in it, so chucking in a gallon of ice water to try and bring the temperature down affects your final result. So I'd shoot low in general and just bring it up. It's not going to hurt.
And the other day, I brewed something which I decided to deploy a protein rest, so I mashed in at about 55. It came down to about 53 Celsius. I then just turned the burners on underneath the pot for the next hour, had the burn on really low, stirred all the time, and ramped all the way up to my mash-out temperature. So that's quite easily doable with this sort of technique.
So step mashing, even decoction mashing, if you want to play with that, it's quite flexible. It lets you do these sorts of things. People have looked at it and gone, oh, well, you'll never be able to decoct. You'll never be able to. How step mashers are going to be really hard, but they're not. They're really easy. You've got a temperature-controlled mash tub. You've got a way to access the grain, because If you want to access the dry portion of the grain, you pull the bag out a bit until the grain surfaces and you scoop it off. And you've got the ability to actually, if you really want to completely remove the grain from the pot, change temperatures and put the grain back in. Because you don't have to scoop things or shovel things. It's all contained in a nice bag. Pull it out, put it in a bucket, do things to the stuff that's in the pot, put the grain back in. I can't say why you'd particularly want to, but actually I can, making a gluten-free beer. It would be quite a good way to separate the enzyme liquor from the grains for making a gluten-free beer.
And what about rest times? Do you have to do anything special for the rest times?
Not really. See, that's it. It looks different, but it's just really, really similar. Given a recipe that says rest for 60 minutes at X temperature, rest for 60 minutes at X temperature. Just do what the recipe says, and you'll be so close to what you expect to come out that there's no difference. It's a tweak next time you brew it situation rather than having to make changes on the fly. If anything, I would perhaps shoot for a longer mash time, because in the very dilute mash of a brew and a bag brew, there's a little bit less contact between the enzymes and the starches. I don't think it needs it, but if you were a bit nervous, if you really wanted to make sure, then maybe mash for a bit longer. But having said that, I don't think you have to. A 60-minute mash is more than sufficient for most forms of brewing, and it's more than sufficient for bag brewing as well.
And Geoff, would you say a mash out is necessary?
I wouldn't say it's necessary in the same way that I wouldn't say that it's necessary for any other form of brewing, but I have found that I get a couple more points extraction if I mash it out, and there's the argument about whether or not it actually denatures the enzymes towards the end. When I'm pulling the bag out of the pot, I'm usually at that stage putting the burners underneath the pot to start bringing it up to boil, and so you could argue that I'm sort of mashing out as part of the process.
When you say mash out with brew in the bag, it's not the same as anywhere else, because in a 3-vessel system or a normally sparge system, you're then going to add hot sparge water, which will bring your grain bed up to sparge temperature, and you're going to increase the temperature that way. Whereas in brew in a bag, you're just pulling the bag out. So if you're just at, say, a 66-degree mash rest, and you pull the bag out, what you've just done is effectively lautered at 66 degrees. Whereas to get decent extraction, you probably want to be lautering at closer to 80 degrees, or 76, 78 degrees Celsius. So you've got a 10 or 12 degree differential, and so the sugars aren't going to be as liquid, they're not going to be as soluble, and so you lose a little bit of extraction potential. Whereas if you heat it up, I don't like to think of it as a mash out, I think of heating it up to sparge temp or lautering temp, and then I pull the bag out. So I'm not doing a mash out really, because I don't care about the enzymes. I'm just getting things to sparge temperature.
So you're going to heat the water up anyway. You're going to heat the wort up anyway. You just watch the temperature, and when it gets to the temperature,
that's right. Before it gets too hot, then you pull it out.
Yeah.
Got to get to boiling anyway. So all you're doing is removing the bag on the way.
Interesting. And you don't do any kind of sparging at all. You just hang the bag over the pot, and you do a bit of squeezing.
Yep. Absolutely.
And which, again, might be frowned upon by some people. But
and once again, another being the bonnet thing. People who know a little bit, but not quite enough.
I just grab a couple of old saucepan lids and I just squeeze it together and just keep squeezing until I'm bored.
and the whole time you're doing that, especially if you've got the bag hanging. If you've got the bag hanging, life becomes a lot easier. Your burners are on. The thing's coming up. So whilst the liquid's heating up to boiling temperature, you're having a bit of a squeeze in the drain out of the pot and chucking it away. So you're not wasting time at all. But having said that, you don't need to have a rope and pulley for this at all. A lot of people go, it's going to be terribly heavy, I'll need a rope and pulley, I've got nowhere to hang a rope and pulley from, how can I ever do this? You don't need one. You can just grab that bag, lift it up until it mostly drains out, throw it in a bucket. Throw it in a bucket, get your flame on so that the wort's starting to come up to a boil, and then go back to your bag. Suspend the bag off a doorknob and squeeze it out into the bucket and then tip that stuff back into the pot. It's not heavy. People think it's going to be heavy, but it isn't. It's only a few kilos of grain and a few kilos of water. I worked it out for that Pilsner we were talking about before. The bag would weigh maybe 12 kilograms. So that's 20-odd pound. It's about the same as a case of beer. If you can hold
unless you made a mistake and you've bought waterproof material for your bag.
That's right. If you bought waterproof material for your bag, you're in trouble. It's going to be heavy. If you bought the right material, it's a case of beer. If you can hold a case of beer at chest height for 10 seconds, you can brew in a bag without any pulleys or ropes.
I can do that.
Any reasonable, any non-injured person, any healthy man or woman could do this without a rope or a pulley, no problems.
Now, one thing that I noticed when I did this on my small scale was that there was a tremendous amount of trub, I say tremendous. There was an excessive, more than I was used to, amount of trub in the brew pot than from when I had a traditional mash tun and a grain bed and was able to do the Vorloff and cycle through and kind of clarify the wort. Do you see that on the full scale brew in a bag as well?
Yeah, look, your wort is going to be really cloudy compared to a normal. See, I keep saying normal because it's not the way I do it. Compared to a traditional mashing system, your wort is going to be extremely cloudy, and it freaks people who've done other sorts of brewing out when they see it. God, it's cloudy. That can't be good. Once again, it's one of those things. People are sure that cloudy wort is bad for beer, but it's not. It's that cloudy wort's not as pretty as clear wort, and because brewers like clear wort better, it's become a byword for good wort. Quality wort is clear. And like you said, at the end of the boil, because a little bit more stuff went into that pot, there'll be a bit more left at the end.
Now, I've got a couple of questions from Twitterland, Twitterville. Ryan from Rockford, Michigan, says or asks, are there any styles that wouldn't work with brew in the bag, and what is the efficiency of a brew in the bag batch?
If you're playing with styles that are at either end of the gravity the OG spectrum, then you're going to have a problem. Your efficiency is going to decrease as you try and brew a stronger beer. And I guess that's something that's in common with batch sparging at any rate. If you're playing in the normal sorts of beers, then I don't think there's anything that you can't try. What do you think, Dan?
I think you're right. I sat down and actually I was when I was first brewing with Cole to think of what sorts of beers you couldn't brew this way, and I couldn't come up with one. At the end of the day, I came up with, given a little bit of imagination, you can brew any beer in this style. You are going to get probably lousy efficiency if you're brewing a barley wine, but yeah, Cole's made barley wines, and I know that Geoff's made strong ales with brew in the bag, so it works. Mm-hmm. It's certainly not a matter of it not working. I can't think of a beer that you couldn't make this way.
I guess you're limited by the size of your brew kettle, but you're limited by the size of your mash tun with a traditional three vessel system or 2 vessel system anyway. Absolutely. I mean, everyone's got their upper limit to size and strength they can make in their brewery, unless you're oversized. And it's the same with brew in the bag. Geoff has an extremely big brew pot, and I can't imagine a beer that Geoff couldn't make in his pot, whereas my brew in a bag pot is smaller, and I run into limitations with the gravity of beer I can make.
Sorry, and at the end of the day, a little bit of LDME can always be thrown in to increase the gravity if you find that you don't quite get there.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
Absolutely true. There's nothing wrong with throwing in a kilo of extract and bumping things up.
Turn it into a partial mash instead of an all-grain batch.
Well, a mostly grain batch, I like to think of them as. Look, most of my beers are mostly grain batches. When I brew on my Herms, I always have DME in the brewery, and if I miss my gravity, I add DME until I hit my gravity.
One more question from the Twitter crowd. I think I twittered at the wrong time of the day, because usually when I Twitter in the morning, I'm flooded with answers because people are avoiding work. But it was close to the end of the day, so I think they were driving on the way home. I got a question from Greg down in New Zealand, and he asks, have you compared the same recipe, brew in a bag versus quote-unquote traditional? So have you taken the same recipe and brewed with the brew in the bag and brewed with, say, your Herm system, and compared the two recipes?
Well, I do it quite frequently because that's my pilot system. When I'm trying a new recipe, usually for a style that I've not brewed before, I will frequently make a small batch of brew in a bag beer to tweak it a little bit, see how it goes, see if I like the style, and then I'll translate it straight up into the Herms. So it's probably not quite side by side, but certainly it's the same recipe brewed on one style and then brewed in a completely different way, and I find that I have to make basically no adjustments.
A couple of years ago, a friend of ours and Dan and myself did exactly that. We had what we called the Great Brewing Experiment, where I got out my drug dealer scales and measured all of the ingredients out, and we took it away and brewed it on our 3 different systems. I had my brew in a bag system, Dan had his Herm system from memory, and our friend Steve had a traditional homebrew 3-vessel system. And we brewed the beers and they all came back and they were different.
I was about to say that's a lousy example, Geoff, because they were really different.
But I think that reinforces my base position, which is that there's more variation among brewers than there are techniques.
Well, absolutely, because Steve's beer was at least as different from my beer, both brewed on 3-vessel systems, as it was from your beer. So there was just as much variation between two more traditional ways of brewing as there was between the bag and the more traditional ways of brewing. 3 quite different beers came out, but to be honest, the 2 that were the most similar were mine and Geoff's. So Steve, who was on a normal system, was probably further from the median than either of us.
I guess the root of the question is essentially probably you didn't see anything in the comparison of those beers to discourage you from the brew in the bag system.
Absolutely not, no.
Opposite, it discouraged me from brewing the other way.
Yeah. Geoff's watched me swear at my home system often enough, so he's completely put off the notion of brewing in any other fashion.
I'll second that.
Yeah, Cole's watched me swear at it too. It's better now, it doesn't leak, trust me. Actually, no, there was some official side-by-side brewing done too when Pat Hollingdale, the guy I mentioned who more or less invented the bag aspect of single-vessel brewing, he did quite a few side-by-side brews where he brewed on his old system and then he brewed it with a bag, or someone else brewed the recipe on the same day as he brewed the recipe with the bag, and there was quite a bit of we really can't tell the difference between these beers going on. Certainly nothing that said this one's better, that one's not better. It's just another way of brewing, it really is.
I think it's really important in that you can look at it as a complete brewing philosophy, or you can see it purely as a wort preparation technique. And then if you want to pull it apart a bit further, you can say it's really just a mashing technique. And that wherever you want to draw the line, from there on it's exactly the same. So as an example, you do not have to change your fermentation process because it's a brew in the bag wort. I think that once you've lifted the bag out of the pot and you're getting ready to boil the thing, apart from the fact that the wort is a little bit cloudier, it really is no difference to any other wort that you're boiling and turning into beer.
Yeah, given recipe A, you're going to come out with the same beer. It's It's just not different enough. It's a little bit different in application and style and technique, but the results just aren't different enough to warrant saying, hey, that was brewed differently. As Geoff said, from the second you take the bag out, it ceases to be different to any other form of brewing.
Is there anything else that you can think of that we haven't talked about or haven't covered that's important?
The hot side aeration demon.
Don't mention that.
Of course, it depends upon whether you're an HSA believer or not. I personally am not, and so I'm probably not well placed to talk about it. I guess if you consider that hot side aeration can cause a problem, then there's the possibility that it might be a problematic process. But I don't think that either of us see it as an issue.
I've never understood actually why people believe that hot side aeration is an issue with brewing a bag. I can't personally see where it comes in. It's if you're a fly sparger and you believe that your grain bed should never be exposed to air, yeah, all right, I get that. Brewing a bag certainly does that, but so does back sparging and so does no sparging. So I really can't see the difference. I've heard people say it, but I can't see where it kicks in. And I don't believe in hot side aeration particularly anyway. So.
And that's why it's difficult for us to talk about it.
It happens to me, I don't believe in it. So.
And when I'm stirring my mash, as I've taken doing, I get in there and give it a good stir. I don't have grain jumping out of the pot, but I certainly make sure that it's well mixed, and certainly in the time frames that my beer lasts before it's consumed, it doesn't seem to show any sort of cardboardy or any other sort of artefacts.
I'm a big promoter of this. I've been a little bit of an evangelist for it in the past, and the reason I am is because I, honest to God, think that brewing all grain this way is easier than partial mashing or extract with steeping grains. I think that those two processes, aside from the need for a bigger pot for brewing a bag, are effectively wastes of time. If you are brewing a straight extract beer, fine, that's cheap, easy and fast. But as soon as you start to complicate that with grains, then I think brewing a bag is just as easy. And there's no reason to not go all grain. I'm 100% convinced that at least for partial mashing, you have to do everything in a partial mash that you do in brewing a bag anyway, and then you've got to bugger around with extract. Just leave the extract out and just do it with grain. It's going to cost you an hour over an extract brew.
Well, you guys have been fun to talk to, and you've given a lot of information for those who don't know anything about brewing a bag to think about. And I do think that, if you've never done all grain before, that this would be an interesting take to move into the system without having to buy all the equipment. You may be like Geoff and stay with brewing a bag, or you may move on like Dan into a higher system. But it is a fairly low-tech way to jump into it, and that appeals to me.
I think so, but I know that Geoff probably mentally cringed when you said move on into a higher system, because I don't think it's
there is that.
It seems like it should just be an introductory step. It seems like it should be a step on the way, but I don't think that it is. Now, Colin's got 20 plus brews for brewing a bag. Geoff's got, what have you got now?
60.
I've only done 15 or 16 brewing a bag brews, but I've got 100 odd normal brews under my belt, and I just can't see a quality difference between those beers and the beers I make on my Herms. And so it's just a legitimate, keep it simple, stupid way to brew. It's not a step. You could use it as one, but I don't see it as a step.
As I built experience in brewing in this method, my beers got better. If I had have chosen a 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 vessel brewing system, my beers would have got better as I got more experience under my belt. That's true. It's almost as though my beers have got better in spite of any of the techniques that I've decided to use.
Well, Dan and Geoff and the silent Colin, I appreciate your time. This has been a lot of fun, and I hope that it's seed for or food for thought for those who haven't tried it. Thanks, guys.
Our pleasure, or my pleasure at least.
Thanks, James.
Well, thanks again to Dan, Geoff, and Colin. If you're thinking about getting into all grain, brewing in a bag is certainly a way to try, and you don't have to start with a full batch. You can do a partial batch and see how you like it. And if you're like Geoff, you may stick with it. And if you do try it, let me know how it goes. I'm curious to see what you guys think. Remember, we've got the Brewer's Logbook and our new Basic Winemaking Introduction to Wine Kits DVD out there in our online store. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com, and please don't forget to tell us where you're from. You can check out our other DVDs, Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, Stepping into All Grain, and Introduction to Extract Homebrewing out on our site. We've got combo deals, too. And we've got shirts. And you can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online in our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com. And thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Fancy Nancy, Explorer Extraordinaire, and Alton Brown Good Eats DVD set. 36 DVDs, 108 episodes by the Food Network Complete DVD Collection. 108 episodes. They put that in there twice with an exclamation point. So they're excited. That is a lot of episodes. Man, that's a lot of work. Thanks again, everybody. Remember, can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping, and we appreciate your support. I've done 180-something episodes of this podcast, by the way. A lot less work, though, in putting together a Good Eats episode. We also have an associate link to the Apple Store on our site, along with audible.com. That's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio, and our website is provided by our buddy Kelly Dodson in Austin, Texas. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.